Yo, welcome to another Reach Training podcast. I guess I'm a host, right? Steven,
Yeah.
and then we got B, and then we got G. So not much of an intro, but we're going to get rocking and rolling.
Steve, B, and G. Yeah. Sounds like a breakfast cereal.
We'll keep working on our intro. We'll get John to fix this and make this a little more like...
Yeah, I think it's fire, bro.
I think it's damn good.
To be honest.
Well, I already dropping a curse word. But yeah, anyways, let's get into what we actually want to talk about. So let's talk about the importance of core training. What a transition, huh?
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, the proper training of your core is something that every athlete needs regardless of sport, but it's also something that gets easily overlooked, right? Like core training is more than a bunch of like sit-ups and crunches, right? And the industry has evolved greatly in the past, decade, 20 years, where there's a lot of specific core training involved to the position. But one of the most common misconceptions is if you have a quote-unquote six-pack or good-looking core, you have a strong core. I'll use Greg as an example. So growing up, and all our thousands of subscribers and listeners know Greg
Millions.
by now. Yeah, millions. Yeah. Also, we need a sponsor. Anyways, but the importance of just like the core training, and just because how it looks doesn't mean it's strong. So when Greg first started training, all he wanted was a six-pack.
That's it.
He was like, "Yo, I'm not getting no six-pack."
So why else do you work out?
But he's getting stronger. He's getting fit, right? He's able to take on a block, right? If you're 260, 270 pounds, unless you're a specimen, I'm not saying Greg wasn't, it's going to be hard to have a chiseled up six-pack, right? So just because someone has a good-looking six-pack doesn't mean it's necessarily a strong core. They probably do a bunch of crunches, or they eat like a bird, which is not much, right? So, but a common misconception, a good-looking six-pack means you have a strong core. 9 times out of 10, probably not. Like with all of our pro athletes we train, besides the rocked-up football players, to be honest, like a lot of our baseball players probably don't have a six-pack. If you're looking at it, you wouldn't think, oh, they got a strong core, but in reality, they have one of the most strongest cores, in any athletic field, just for how fast and how often they have to rotate and use their core. But the importance of core training can't be stated enough, right? Like in any sport, any athletic adventure.
I would kind of piggybacking off of that. I would blame, once again, we always blame social media, but I really blame social media because, like to your point, when you came in, all you wanted was a visual look. So the core, people think of the core as what I can see on the front end, right? And so, but if you look at social media, I mean, kudos to these people that can put themselves in a visually appealing look, but it's like, oh, I want to go for a certain look. And the look that you're going for as a high school athlete or a college athlete is the look that I see on social media, which is 9 times out of 10 is somebody that's a bodybuilder.
Like me.
Who could never really do what you do in a high school level, right? They wouldn't even be able to go out there and pitch what a high school pitcher pitches, but they're like, okay, that's the look I want to go for. And it's like, no, instead of going for a look, you want to go for actual, how does it feel? How does it work? Does it move? Does it feel good? And like we talk about the core being the chain that drives everything from the ground up and connects to the upper half. When we talk about shoulder-hip separation, a good, strong, stable core is going to help with that. We talk about producing power. We've had talks about power output and producing force. And if you have a weak core, then there's a break somewhere between the two. I like to just, in dumbed down terms or just layman's terms, is more about if you got a weak core, it's like punching somebody on skates, right? You're not going to get that force from the ground up if your core is weak, and it's not really what it looks like, but how it functions. And that's what we go for. We want to go for functionality, and we care less about what it looks like. Like we talked about too, like you take pictures in the MLB and you stack them up shoulder to shoulder, and you look, tell them to take their shirts off and look at them. However,
not
you
all
know what I'm saying? Not all of them, but
the ones we train.
For the most part, you're looking at baseball players like, you look in a grocery store. Most pitchers could probably walk in a grocery store and people look at them besides their height and be like, okay, they don't really look like a athlete. Versus you put some hitters in the grocery store, they may look more like hitters. However, it's the functionality and the skill of a pitcher, like we talked about. Their cores probably function a lot better than some position players, if they're pretty powerful at that
Would you
point.
guys say, because I know when people bring up core, it's like all about abs and 8-pack, 6-pack, 12-pack like I used to have.
Right, before you were born.
But like, is there like it's core, right? So it wraps around. Like, is there back components into it? Like, what is it that like we're looking at?
That's a good question. I guess it'd be someone's like definition of your core, right? When you typically think of core, but even by the normal definition of your core musculature, there are attachments and origins and insertions of the core's tendon. Like you got different muscle group that makes up your core that attaches to your vertebrae, attaches to the fascia of the vertebrae. So in sense, it does kind of make up kind of the backside, if you will. And saying that, like the importance of the core is simple, but it's trained in a complex position just because the core has to do so much stuff. But in hindsight, and just like to make it as simple as possible, it is the energy transfer essentially, right? Like you're putting force in the ground, whatever you're doing, whether you're taking off on a football field, you're throwing, you're hitting, force has to be initiated from the lower half, then transferred up, and then the output, if you're throwing a ball, is going to be your upper body. But it gets there because your core stays stiff and rigid, right? Or it's able to rotate extremely fast. So, like if you look at elite pitchers and you take down like a biomechanical like measurement of things, most of the time, or one of the measurements you'll see is their torso is able to rotate extremely fast, right? So it has to stay rigid without any energy leaks, like Brandon referred to, but also has to be able to move fast and move as one, right? So the spine and pelvis have to kind of work together. So we've talked a lot about like the function of the core and training it to move fast and training to move in your plane, but you also have to train it to resist force and to absorb force, especially if you're a rotational athlete.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Does that have anything to do with like mobility?
It can.
Like its mobility, like if you don't have any thoracic mobility, is that like
definitely with rotation?
Are you lacking a core?
Because if I can't rotate, then the musculature can't get strong at like in range position. You know what I mean? But even like in your position, a defensive lineman or running back, like you need to be able to resist force too. You need to have an anti-rotational component to training. So all these like reach outs and slashes where the spine and pelvis don't move essentially is important, I think, for any athletic movement. But there's more rotation involved than probably most athletes think in other sports. Like throwing and hitting, throwing a football, throwing a baseball, hitting is rotational movement, but pass rushing, you got some rotational movements going on, right? Like blocking, like if you can't resist rotating, like you got some stuff going on, right? So I think there's more of I think the rotational side of things as far as like training the core is something that doesn't get overlooked in the baseball community, but maybe in like other sports it's easy to get overlooked.
100%.
Plus too, like
basketball too, right? That it gets overlooked a lot. Right?
Think of the position we talked about, the position you find yourself in outside of baseball. Like baseball's always think rotational sports. You think, just baseball or golf or tennis. But you look at, like talk about if you look at zeroing in somebody in the defensive line in football or in basketball, they're going for a layup. If you freeze frame or look at those movements, 9 times out of 10, they're not in a perfect, unbroken linear square movement. There is some rotation happening very fast, and you're never in the right. What's the perfect position? Yeah. Right. You're never really in a perfect position in football, especially when you talk about engaging another human being and dropping and getting around. Your body's never in that just neutral state.
Yeah. The more rigid the core is, the more like proximal stability you're gonna have. You know what I mean? It's like the more
and what does that mean?
My limbs are gonna be. So like if I'm strong through here, I have more stability in long positions. If that makes sense, because the energy is being transferred through here. If I'm loosey goosey and weak and don't have good activity through here, or my motor control isn't where it probably needs to be, then I'm not going to be as stable through here. So if you have a really mobile guy, like sometimes we'll assess really mobile athletes, really mobile pitchers, and I tell them to give me a basic front plank, they have like no core awareness, and they just kind of hang out here, and like that contribits to a reason why someone's shoulder maybe giving them some problems, because there's no stability here, together. Right? There's no exactly. So real quick, let's talk about like 3 kind of how we introduce core training before we wrap this mega podcast up. But most of our core trainings, if anyone wants to have some type of takeaway, is we have some type of anti-extension work, right? And that just means avoiding the spine going into extension. So we want to keep the spine neutral. We have some type of anti-rotational work, kind of what we were talking about, where the spine doesn't rotate. So we try to make force pull you to rotate. You have to resist it. And once you get strong in that position, at some point we do have rotational movements, but that's not usually a thing that we put in right off the bat. And then we have some type of like lateral flexion movement where we're trying to get out of lateral flexion or hold a certain position. And that's going to kind of be like more specific to like the oblique natures, if you will. So
Absolutely.
we have, those are kind of our main 3 basic components of our core training, and then we have, advanced movements on top of that.
Only thing I'll piggyback off of that is I would say usually for the most part we probably start in more of a static position first, like you talked about with the all those things, anti-extension, anti-flexion, anti-rotation. It's always going to start static first before we start introducing some dynamic or heavy rotation.
And that kind of goes to like what we talked about a couple of days ago. Like you always want to teach how to break before you teach the gaps.
Right. Before the easiest thing to understand is just, hey, let's just engage the core in a static stance, sense, maybe working against gravity or working against the floor like we're doing in a front plank, a side plank, or anti-rotational movement, just to teach just a feel, a position, finding neutral, keeping it simple, short and simple, before we start doing any movement stuff with that.
Because most kids, they haven't done a front plank right their whole life, or even like high-level guys that we train. And so 30 seconds, they're like, whoa.
Yeah, and it's a thing of feel. You just said that, right? 9 times out of 10, and no disrespect to anybody's program, but usually it's like, hey, let's get to the movement stuff. Let's rotate. And there's a place for that. But, hey, let's just strip all the other things away. Even with a higher level athlete, and let's start in a place that's just a static, basic, like you said, a basic front plank. And at that front plank position and that basic movement, I can diagnose, okay, do we have an understanding of neutral, or you do have a good core, are you good at fighting lumbar extension, just in that basic sense, outside of having to put you in a heavy rotation or a heavy dynamic movement and then going from there.
And I know we're wrapping this up, but like what are the dangers, just for people who are out there training, like what are the dangers of not having that static part first, or learning how to control it or bring that awareness to your core? Like what can happen if you don't implement that into your training at the beginning, if you don't?
Really, really good question. I think it comes back to just like how we view our training to begin with. If you get strong in a faulty position, then at some point there's going to be a break somewhere or a compensation somewhere, and then that's going to lead to kind of unwanted things. You can get strong in like an unstable core position, but at some point it's going to catch up to you if you want to be an elite athlete.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And I think to his point, I think as far as awareness, I think eliminating as many variables as possible, and let's focus on one thing. That's good, because as an athlete, it can be revealed to you what things you lack if you eliminate all these extra variables. So I would say that if we're just starting just a static sense, I can build an awareness as an athlete of what problems I have being in extension there, versus having you do a explosive rotation movement and I can't zero in on what's wrong.